They laughed when she didn't speak. Not openly. Not loudly. But in the way powerful people laugh, with smug looks, whispered jokes, and eyes already celebrating victory. The Superior Divorce Court of Manhattan was packed that morning. Marble floors, high ceilings, expensive suits, sharpened smiles. This wasn't just a divorce. This was a public execution. At the center of it all sat Elena Blackwood, the ex-wife no one was worried about. She wore no designer dress, no diamonds, no dramatic makeup. Just a plain navy blue coat, buttoned to the top, her dark hair pulled back neatly. Her hands rested calmly on the table, fingers interlocked, unmoving. Too calm. Across from her sat Richard Hale, billionaire real estate tycoon, media darling, and her soon-to-be ex-husband. He looked relaxed, confident, almost bored. Richard leaned back in his chair, whispering something to his lead attorney, Martin Crowe, one of the most ruthless divorce lawyers in the city. Crowe smirked and nodded. This case was already over. At least, that's what everyone believed. The gallery was filled with reporters, bloggers, junior lawyers, and curious elites who had come to witness the fall of a woman who, in their eyes, had overplayed her hand by marrying above her station. She didn't even hire a real lawyer. Someone whispered, "She thinks silence will save her." Another scoffed, "She's finished." Elena heard it all. She chose not to react. For 3 straight days, the courtroom had been a slaughterhouse. Martin Crowe had dismantled her life piece by piece. He painted Elena as a gold digger who had contributed nothing to the marriage, a woman who benefited from luxury without adding value, a woman who should be grateful for whatever crumbs were thrown her way. Richard played his role perfectly. Whenever Crowe spoke of sacrifice, Richard lowered his head like a wounded saint. Whenever Elena was accused of indifference, Richard sighed deeply, as if burdened by her failures. And Elena? She said nothing. No objections, no emotional breakdowns, no desperate explanations. Her court-appointed attorney, Lydia Park, had tried. God, she had tried. But every argument was crushed beneath Crowe's rehearsed dominance. By the end of day 3, even Lydia looked defeated. "Elena," she whispered urgently during a brief recess, "we're losing everything. The properties, the settlement, the support. He's pushing for nothing. 0. Elena didn't look at her lawyer. She was staring at the judge, not pleading, not angry, observing. "Do you want to testify?" Lydia asked quietly. "If you don't speak now, the court will assume you agree with their narrative." Elena finally turned her head. Her eyes were steady, clear, sharp. "Not yet," she said softly. Lydia swallowed. "Not yet when? When it matters. Back in the courtroom." Judge Samuel Whitmore, a seasoned jurist with 30 years on the bench, adjusted his glasses and reviewed the final documents. He had seen this story hundreds of times. Rich husband, quiet wife, power imbalance disguised as legal fairness. He glanced at Elena. She looked unreadable. "Mr. Crowe," the judge said, "you may proceed with your final argument regarding asset division." Crowe stood, buttoning his tailored jacket like a man stepping onto a stage. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this case is painfully simple. My client built an empire long before this marriage ever existed. Miss Blackwood, entered that empire, enjoyed its benefits, and contributed nothing measurable in return." Richard nodded solemnly. Crowe continued, voice dripping with false sympathy. "She has no independent assets. No family support disclosed. No business involvement, no evidence of sacrifice beyond what any spouse would reasonably provide." He turned, gesturing subtly toward Elena. "Silence speaks volumes, Your Honor." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery. Richard's lips curled slightly. Elena didn't move. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Miss Blackwood," he said, finally addressing her directly, "you've remained silent throughout these proceedings. Is there anything you wish to say before I rule?" The room held its breath. This was it. This was her last chance. Every eye locked onto her. Elena slowly stood. Her chair made a soft sound against the floor, small but somehow loud in the stillness. She didn't rush, didn't fidget. She looked at the judge, then briefly at Richard, then back at the judge. "Yes," she said calmly. The gallery leaned forward. Even Crow frowned slightly. "I have something to say," Elena continued, "but before I do, I would like to ask the court a question." Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "You may," Elena inhaled once, not nervously, deliberately. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear and steady, "before you finalize this ruling, may I ask whether the court has verified the full disclosure of Mr. Hale's familial affiliations?" Richard stiffened. Crow turned sharply. "Objection. Relevance." Judge Whitmore held up a hand. "Elaborate, Ms. Blackwood." Elena met his gaze. "Because," she said quietly, "the narrative being presented assumes I am alone, powerless, without backing." She paused. "That assumption is incorrect." A murmur spread through the room. Richard laughed under his breath. "Your Honor," Crow said confidently, "this is a last-ditch distraction. Ms. Blackwood has already submitted sworn statements declaring no external financial support." Elena didn't deny it. She smiled. Just slightly. "I declared no personal assets," she corrected. "Not no family." Judge Whitmore studied her for a long moment. Then he asked, almost casually, "And who, Miss Blackwood, is your family?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Elena didn't answer immediately. She glanced toward the back of the courtroom, toward the heavy wooden doors, and for the first time in 3 days, she waited. The silence Elena left behind was heavier than any argument. Judge Whitmore's question still hung in the air like a blade suspended mid-fall. "And who, Miss Blackwood, is your family?" Richard Hale scoffed softly, shaking his head. He leaned toward Martin Crow and whispered, loud enough for the first row to hear, "This is pathetic. She's bluffing." Crow smirked. "Desperation does that." The reporters exchanged looks, pens hovered, cameras refocused. Everyone was waiting for Elena to crack, but she didn't. She remained standing, hands folded in front of her, eyes calm, not defiant, not emotional. Simply patient. "Your Honor," Crow said smoothly, "unless Ms. Blackwood intends to introduce admissible evidence, I suggest we proceed." The court's time. Boom. The sound didn't come from the judge's gavel. It came from the back of the courtroom. The massive oak doors, rarely used, usually ceremonial, swung open with force, slamming against the marble walls. The sound echoed like thunder. Every head turned. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward. "Court is in session. You can't." But his voice died in his throat, because the people entering didn't look lost. They looked intentional. 4 men stepped in first, dressed in dark tailored suits, movements synchronized, eyes scanning the room with military precision. Not bodybuilders, not cops, professionals. They spread out subtly, positioning themselves along the walls, blocking exits without making it obvious. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore straightened. Who authorized this disruption? No one answered him. Because then they walked in, a man and a woman. The man was tall, silver-haired, his presence commanding without a single raised voice. His suit was charcoal gray, understated but unmistakably expensive. He carried himself like someone who had never needed permission in his life. Beside him walked a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, elegant, dressed in a black power suit that fit like armor. She held a leather briefcase embossed with a simple crest, an emblem few people recognized immediately. But the ones who did went pale. The room didn't erupt, it froze. Richard Hale's smile vanished. Martin Crow's confident posture stiffened. The judge leaned forward, squinting. "Sir, ma'am, identify yourselves." The silver-haired man stopped in the center aisle. He looked at the judge, then briefly at Richard, then at Elena. And when his eyes met hers, something changed. The steel softened. "Just for a moment. Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor," the man said calmly. His voice was low, controlled, and powerful in a way that didn't need volume. "We were delayed by traffic." A pause. "My name is Jonathan Blackwood." The name hit the room like a shockwave. One reporter gasped. Another dropped her pen. A junior attorney in the back whispered, "No way." Richard's face drained of color. Judge Whitmore's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Jonathan Blackwood?" "Yes." The woman beside him stepped forward. "And I'm Catherine Blackwood Hayes, senior partner at Blackwood Hayes and Company." Martin Crowe swallowed. Blackwood Hayes and Company didn't handle divorces. They handled mergers, governments, international collapses. They didn't walk into courtrooms uninvited. Unless so, Meething big was about to happen. Crowe found his voice. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. These individuals are not listed counsel." "Already filed," Catherine said smoothly, opening her briefcase and handing documents to the bailiff, electronically. 15 minutes ago." The bailiff glanced at the papers, then at the judge. His face tightened. Judge Whitmore took the documents, scanned them quickly, then looked up at Elena. "Miss Blackwood," he said slowly, "are these people here on your behalf?" Elena finally spoke again. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned, walked down the aisle, and stopped in front of Jonathan Blackwood. "Dad," she said quietly. The word echoed louder than the door had. "Dad." A stunned silence crashed over the courtroom. Richard staggered back in his chair. That's not possible." Jonathan Blackwood placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "I'm here," he said. "We all are." Judge Whitmore removed his glasses. "Mr. Blackwood," he said carefully, "for the record, are you confirming a familial relationship with the petitioner?" Jonathan nodded once. "Elena is my daughter." The courtroom exploded into whispers. Jonathan Blackwood, founder of Blackwood Global Holdings, one of the most powerful private financial dynasties on the East Coast. A man whose name appeared in footnotes of history books, not tabloids. Richard Hale had done business adjacent to Blackwood companies for years. He had never once imagined. "That's impossible," Richard snapped, standing abruptly. "She said she had no family, no money. She lived like a normal person?" Catherine cut in coldly. "Yes, that was her choice." Elena turned slowly to Richard. "I told you I wanted a simple life," she said evenly. "You never asked why." Jonathan looked at Richard now, and the look was not anger. It was disappointment. "She asked us to stay way," Jonathan said calmly. "She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for our name." Richard laughed nervously. "This is some kind of setup." "No," Catherine replied. "This is accountability." Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "Given this development, the court will take a brief recess." Elena shook her head. "No recess, Your Honor." The judge looked surprised. "I've been silent for 3 days," Elena continued. "Not because I was afraid, but because I needed everything on record." She turned back to the judge. "Now, I'm ready to speak." Richard felt something cold settle in his chest. For the first time since the trial began, he wasn't in control anymore. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a battlefield where the balance had suddenly, violently shifted. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, studying the people now standing in his courtroom, people who did not belong to the usual ecosystem of divorce hearings and broken marriages. Jonathan Blackwood stood quietly, his hands resting on the silver head of his cane. He didn't need to speak loudly. His presence did the talking for him. Catherine Blackwood Hayes placed her briefcase on the table with a soft, deliberate click. The sound alone seemed to snap the room back into order. "Your Honor," she said, composed and precise, "before any ruling is issued, the court must be made aware that the foundational assumptions of this case are flawed." Martin Crowe tried to regain his footing. "This is absurd. Family identity doesn't change the facts." Ms. Blackwood signed disclosures. "Elena," Jonathan said calmly, not raising his voice. She stepped forward. Crowe faltered for half a second, then scoffed. "Fine, Elena. She declared no assets." "And she didn't lie," Catherine said. "She owns nothing personally." Richard exhaled sharply, relief flickering across his face. You see, this is just theatrics." Catherine turned to him. "Mr. Hale," she said coolly, Do you know the difference between owning something and controlling it? Richard frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Elena finally took the stand, not the witness stand, but the center of the room. She faced the judge, her posture straight, her voice steady. I didn't marry Richard for money, she said. I married him because I believed in him. Richard scoffed. You believed in my bank account. I believed in the man you pretended to be, Elena replied. A ripple of tension moved through the gallery. For 10 years, she continued, I watched him build companies, sign deals, shake hands with people who saw him as powerful. And I stayed quiet. I stayed invisible. She looked at Crow. You called me powerless, she said. You assumed silence meant weakness. Crow shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan took a step forward now. Your Honor, he said, my daughter didn't come to us when her marriage began to fail. She didn't ask for help. She didn't ask for protection. Richard laughed bitterly. How noble. Jonathan's gaze snapped to him. She didn't ask, Jonathan continued, unbothered, because she wanted to know if you would treat her with respect even when she had none to offer you. The words landed like a verdict. Richard's jaw tightened. Catherine opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. Let's discuss facts, she said. She handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and opposing counsel. Crow's confident expression cracked as he skimmed the first page. What is this? He demanded. Trust documentation, Catherine replied. Specifically, the Blackwood Family Strategic Trust. Judge Whitmore's eyebrows rose. That trust hasn't been publicly active in years. It has, Catherine said, just quietly. Elena spoke again. 3 years ago, she said, when Richard's flagship development project was on the verge of collapse, someone stepped in. Richard stiffened. That project was saved by a private investment group, Elena continued. A group that required no publicity, no board seat, and no public acknowledgement. Richard swallowed. Vanguard East Holdings, Crow muttered, reading aloud. Elena nodded. That company is a shell, Catherine added, owned entirely by the Blackwood Trust. The gallery erupted into whispers. Richard shot to his feet. That's impossible. That money came from my family, Elena finished calmly. At my request, Richard stared at her like he was seeing a stranger. You invested in my company? Yes. How much? Judge Whitmore asked. Catherine didn't hesitate. 48%. The number sucked the air out of the room. Crow went pale. Richard laughed hysterically. That's a lie. I own the majority. On paper, Catherine replied. Until last month. She clicked a remote. The courtroom monitors flickered to life. Stock transfer logs, voting rights reallocations, legal timestamps. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, eyes scanning. Elena Blackwood, Catherine said, is not a dependent spouse. She turned slightly, meeting Richard's gaze. She is your largest stakeholder. Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed back into his chair. That means, Catherine continued, any attempt to strip her of assets becomes problematic. Crow stammered. Your Honor, this wasn't disclosed. It didn't have to be, Elena said softly, because you never asked the right questions. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses again. Mr. Hale, he said slowly, were you aware of this ownership structure? Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Jonathan spoke quietly. She stayed silent, he said, because she wanted you to lie first. The judge looked sharply at Richard. You testified under oath that no third-party entities held controlling interest in your assets. Richard's hands began to shake. That was before you were exposed, Elena asked. The courtroom was deathly quiet now. The laughter was gone. The smugness evaporated. Only fear remained. Judge Whitmore leaned back. I believe, he said carefully, this court needs to reassess more than just asset division. He looked directly at Richard. I have a few questions of my own. Richard's heart sank. This was no longer a divorce. This was an unraveling. The courtroom felt colder now, not because the temperature had changed, but because fear had entered the room. Judge Whitmore sat perfectly still, fingers resting against his chin, eyes fixed on Richard Hale. The confidence that once filled the billionaire's posture had evaporated. His shoulders slumped slightly, his breath uneven. For the first time in 3 days, Richard Hale looked small. "Mr. Hale," the judge said slowly, deliberately, "you testified under oath that you were the sole controlling authority over your assets and affiliated entities." Richard swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor. And you further testified," the judge continued, "that no external trusts, shell companies, or family offices held voting power in your businesses." Crow shut up. "Your Honor." The judge raised a single finger. "Sit down, Mr. Crow." Crow froze. The gallery went silent. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. "Mr. Hale," he repeated, "were you aware that 48% of your flagship company was owned by an entity connected to the Blackwood Family Trust?" Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I didn't know who was behind it," he stammered. "I just knew the capital came in when we needed it." Elena tilted her head slightly. "You didn't ask?" "She has." "Ked calmly." Richard snapped toward her. "You had no right to do that behind my back." "I was your wife," Elena replied, "and your company was collapsing." Jonathan Blackwood spoke then, his voice low but cutting. "She saved you." Richard laughed weakly. "You expect the court to believe that?" Catherine stepped forward, her tone clinical. "We don't expect belief, Mr. Hale. We have documentation." She handed another set of files to the bailiff. Judge Whitmore flipped through them carefully. Investment timelines, board approvals, emergency capital injections, all signed by Elena Blackwood, the judge murmured. Richard's face drained of color. "You used her money," Catherine said, "to stabilize your empire, and then you tried to erase her." Crow found his voice again. "Your Honor, even if this is true, none of this negates the marital dissolution. It changes everything." The judge interrupted sharply. Crow went quiet. Judge Whitmore turned to Elena. "Miss Blackwood," he said, "why didn't you disclose this earlier?" Elena didn't hesitate. "Because I needed the truth," she said, "not the performance." She turned to Richard. "I needed you to say under oath that you owned everything, that I contributed nothing, that no one stood behind me." Richard clenched his fists. "You set me up." "No," Elena said. "You exposed yourself." Jonathan nodded slightly. "She waited," he said, "because lies collapse best when they're fully built." The judge exhaled slowly. "Mr. Hale," he said, "do you understand the legal consequences of misrepresentation and perjury in this court?" Richard's voice cracked. "Your Honor, I didn't intentionally lie." "You benefited from the lie," the judge said coldly. The words hung heavy. Catherine continued. "There's more." Crow's head snapped up. "More?" "Yes," Catherine said. "The Blackwood Trust didn't just invest." She clicked the remote again. New documents appeared on the screen. Loan agreements, personal guarantees, collateral disclosures. Richard's eyes widened. Judge Whitmore frowned. "These are margin loans," Jonathan answered calmly. "When Mr. Hale's liquidity became unstable, he borrowed against future earnings, using his controlling shares as collateral." Richard stood abruptly. "That's confidential and overdue," Catherine replied. She pointed to a date. "2 missed margin calls," she said, "both within the last 60 days. The judge's gaze hardened. "Which means," Judge Whitmore said slowly, "control of those shares would revert to the lender," Catherine finished. "And the lender," Elena said softly, "is a subsidiary of the Blackwood Trust." The courtroom erupted. Crow staggered back into his chair. Richard's knees buckled. He grabbed the table for support. "That's not possible," he whispered. Jonathan took a step forward. "You didn't read the fine print," he said. "You never do." Elena looked at Richard now, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far worse. Finality. "You told me I was replaceable," she said, "that I brought nothing." Richard looked up at her, eyes glassy. "Elena, please." Judge Whitmore raised his gavel. "Order." The room fell silent again. He turned to Crow. "Mr. Crow," the judge said, "I suggest you advise your client very carefully." Crow nodded numbly. The judge looked back at Richard. "This court is now reviewing potential perjury, asset concealment, and fraudulent testimony." Richard's breath hitched. "And," the judge added, "we are nowhere near finished." He glanced at Elena. "Ms. Blackwood," he said, "is there anything else the court should know?" Elena took a breath. "Yes." She looked straight at Richard. "There's one more thing you forgot," she said quietly. "The Judge ain't in, and what is that?" Elena's voice was steady. "The question you never asked me." Richard frowned weakly. "What question?" Elena smiled, not kindly. "You never asked," she said, "what I would do if I stopped protecting you." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard realized too late that this wasn't just about losing a divorce. He was watching his entire empire begin to fall, and Elena was no longer holding it up. Richard Hale had built his life on momentum, on the belief that as long as he kept moving forward, closing deals, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, nothing behind him could catch up. But momentum is useless when the ground disappears. He felt it now. The courtroom, once his arena, had turned hostile. Faces that once admired him now watched with clinical curiosity, as if observing a controlled demolition. Judge Whitmore sat back, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Hale," he said, "this court will recess briefly to review the new evidence submitted." Richard exhaled sharply in relief. A recess meant time to spin, time to negotiate, time to regain control. But Elena didn't move. "Your Honor," Catherine Blackwood Hayes said calmly, "before the recess, may we submit one additional notice?" The judge paused. "Proceed." Catherine nodded to one of the men in the dark suits standing along the wall. He stepped forward and handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. Judge Whitmore opened it, read. His jaw tightened. Crow leaned forward anxiously. "Your Honor?" Judge Whitmore looked up slowly. "This court has just been notified," he said, "that the Securities Oversight Board has initiated a preliminary inquiry into Hale Holdings." The words landed like gunfire. Richard shot to his feet. "That's impossible! No one informed me!" Catherine's voice was calm, almost gentle. "They didn't need to," she said. "It's automatic when discrepancies reach a certain threshold." Richard turned to Crow, panic flaring in his eyes. "You said this was clean." Crow swallowed. "I didn't know about the margin loans." Jonathan Blackwood spoke quietly. "Because you didn't ask," he said. "Just like Richard," the judge continued. "In addition," Judge Whitmore said, "this court has received confirmation that Hale Holdings' primary banking partner has frozen several accounts pending review." The gallery buzzed. Richard's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't freeze my accounts without notice." "They can," Catherine replied, "when there's suspicion of misrepresentation tied to fiduciary responsibility." Elena watched him. For 10 years she had watched him lose his temper at waiters, intimidate junior staff, dismiss warnings. This was the first time she had ever seen him truly afraid. Crow leaned in, whispering urgently, "Richard, you need to stay quiet." Richard shoved his chair back. "Quiet? She destroyed me." Elena finally spoke. "No," she said evenly. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped cleaning up after you." Judge Whitmore raised his gavel again. "Mr. Hale," he warned, "another outburst will result in contempt." Richard collapsed back into his seat, breathing hard. The recess was called, but the damage had already begun. The hallway outside the courtroom was chaos. Reporters flooded the marble corridors, phones pressed to ears, voices hushed but frantic. Hale Holdings under investigation. Blackwood family connection revealed. Billionaire divorce turns hostile takeover. Richard stood near a pillar, Crow beside him, both surrounded by a wall of security. Crow rubbed his temples. "We need to talk settlement. Immediately." Richard laughed bitterly. "Settlement? With her?" "Yes," Crow hissed. "Before this gets worse." Richard looked through the glass doors. Elena Saint, Oud with her father and Catherine, calm, composed, untouched by the storm outside. "They planned this," Richard muttered. "No," Crow said quietly. "They anticipated you." Across the room, Catherine checked her phone. "Board meeting just moved up," she said to Elena. "Emergency session. Hale Holdings directors are nervous." Elena nodded once. Jonathan studied his daughter. "Are you ready?" She met his gaze. "I've been ready for a long time." Back inside the courtroom, the recess ended early. Judge Whitmore returned with a different posture now, more rigid, more formal. "This court has reviewed the submissions," he said, "and I have serious concerns." He looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Hale, based on preliminary findings, your testimony regarding asset ownership appears incomplete." Richard clenched his jaw. "Incomplete," the judge continued, "is a generous word." Crow closed his eyes. "I am ordering," Judge Whitmore said, "an immediate suspension of any asset transfers, liquidation, or restructuring by Hale Holdings until further notice." Richard felt like the floor dropped out from under him. "You can't do that," he whispered. "I can," the judge replied, "and I am." He turned to Elena. "Ms. Blackwood, effective immediately, you are granted temporary protective interest over all jointly disputed assets." A murmur spread through the room. Richard stared at her. "You took everything," he said hoarsely. Elena shook her head. "No," she replied. "I took responsibility." Crow stood. "Your Honor, we request time to respond." "Denied," the judge said. "This court is no longer convinced that time benefits your client." Richard's hands trembled. This wasn't a loss. This was collapse. Outside, the news broke in real time. Stock alerts buzzed. Calls went unanswered. Partners distanced themselves. Richard's phone vibrated non-stop. He didn't answer a single call, because deep down he knew this was the beginning of the end. Elena gathered her things calmly. As she walked past him, Richard reached out instinctively. "Elena," he whispered, "please, we can fix this." She stopped, turned, looked at him, not as a husband, not even as an enemy, but as a lesson. "You had 10 years to fix this," she said softly. Then she walked away, and Richard Hale finally understood. The silence he mocked was the sound of dominoes lining up. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It felt like a place of judgment. Not the kind written in statutes or case law, but the kind that settles into history. The kind people whisper about years later and say, "That was the day everything changed." Richard Hale sat rigid in his chair, staring straight ahead. He hadn't slept. His phone had died sometime after midnight. Battery drained by unanswered calls, messages from board members, partners, bankers, people who once needed him and now wanted distance. Crow sat beside him, silent for the first time since the trial began. No advice, no confidence, no plan. Across the aisle, Elena Blackwood sat with her hands folded neatly on the table. She looked lighter, not relieved, just unburdened. Judge Whitmore entered precisely at 9 a.m. The bailiff called the court to order, but the sound barely registered. Every person in the room was already standing, already alert. This was it. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and reviewed the file in front of him. "Before this court proceeds to final determinations," he said slowly, "there is one matter that requires clarification." Richard's chest tightened. The judge looked up, and for the first time in the entire trial, he addressed Elena directly. "Ms. Blackwood," he said, "I have a question for you." The room went still. Elena met his gaze calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore paused, then asked the question no one expected. "Why," he said, "did you remain silent for so long?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard blinked. Crow frowned. The judge continued, "You sat through character attacks, accusations, claims that you contributed nothing to this marriage, to the company, to your own life." He leaned forward slightly. "Yet you did not interrupt. You did not react. You did not defend yourself. Silence. Why?" Every camera in the room angled toward Elena. She took a breath, not a shaky one, a steady one. "Because," she said quietly, "I needed the truth to come from him." Richard's head snapped toward her. Elena continued, "For 10 years I spoke up, in private, in boardrooms, at home. I warned him. I covered for him. I corrected mistakes he never acknowledged." She looked at the judge again. "But I learned something important." "What's that?" Judge Whitmore asked. Elena's voice didn't rise, but it carried. When people are protected from consequences, she said, they tell on themselves. A hush fell over the room. She turned slightly, her eyes finally meeting Richard's. You didn't need me to expose you, she said. You just needed space. Richard opened his mouth. No words came out. Judge Whitmore leaned back, absorbing that. Thank you, he said. That answers more than you realize. He turned his attention to Richard. Mr. Hale, the judge said, stand. Richard rose on unsteady legs. This court has reviewed extensive documentation regarding Hale Holdings, including forensic audits, banking records, internal communications, and sworn testimony. The judge's voice hardened. It is the court's finding that you knowingly misrepresented marital assets, concealed liabilities, and engaged in conduct that placed joint and corporate interests at risk. Crowe stood. Abruptly, Your Honor, sit down, Judge Whitmore snapped. Crowe froze. Sat. Richard swallowed. In addition, the judge continued, this court finds no evidence supporting your claims that Ms. Blackwood was uninvolved, dependent, or deceptive in her conduct. Judge Whitmore looked directly at Richard. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. Richard's hands trembled. This court is also aware, the judge said, that criminal investigations into your corporate practices are ongoing. While that matter is outside this courtroom, it is relevant to my decisions here. He lifted his gavel slightly. Therefore, the word hung heavy. This court rules as follows. Every breath stopped. Elena Blackwood is awarded full legal separation with immediate effect. Richard barely heard it. She retains her premarital assets in full. He felt dizzy. All jointly held assets are to be restructured under a protective trust pending further review. Crowe whispered, Richard, Hale Holdings is prohibited from initiating any financial actions without court oversight. Richard's knees felt weak. And, Judge Whitmore said, his voice final, Mr. Hale is denied exclusive control or claim to any disputed asset until all investigations conclude. The gavel came down. Once, hard. This court is adjourned. The sound of chairs moving, voices rising, reporters scrambling, it all blurred. Richard stood there, still, as if frozen in time. Elena gathered her papers calmly. Jonathan Blackwood stood, placing a hand on her shoulder. You did well, he said quietly. Catherine smiled faintly. Very well. As Elena stepped into the aisle, Richard turned toward her. Elena, he said hoarsely. You wanted to punish me. She stopped, turned, looked at him. No, she said, I wanted the truth to survive you. Then she walked past him, out of the courtroom. Out of the marriage, out of the shadow she had lived in for a decade. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions. Miss Blackwood, is this over? Do you feel vindicated? Elena paused, looked at the cameras. This was never about revenge, she said. It was about ending a lie. She stepped into the waiting car. As the door closed, Richard Hale remained behind, alone, surrounded by noise. But for the first time in his life, unable to control the narrative, the world outside the courthouse didn't wait. It never does. Within minutes of Judge Whitmore's ruling, the story exploded across every major network. Headlines rolled in real time, ruthless and unforgiving. CEO loses control amid divorce scandal. Quiet wife was silent partner all along. Hale Holdings under investigation as court strips founder of power. Richard Hale sat alone in the back seat of a hired sedan, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in his adult life, no one was calling him sir, no assistant, no driver, no entourage, just silence. And this time it wasn't his weapon, it was his punishment. 2 days later, the board meeting took place without him. Richard watched it unfold from a muted television in his penthouse, one he technically still occupied, though eviction papers had already been drafted. The chairman, a man Richard had personally appointed, cleared his throat. Effective immediately, the man said, Richard Hale is placed on indefinite leave pending the outcome of federal investigations. Richard laughed softly. A hollow sound. They didn't even use the word fired. They didn't need to. The message was clear. He was finished. Across the city, Elena Blackwood stood in a quiet office overlooking the river. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was minimalist, calm, deliberate. Jonathan Blackwood stood beside her, reading from a tablet. "Preliminary asset stabilization is complete," he said. "The trust is secure. No exposure." Catherine looked up from her notes. "And the narrative has shifted. Public opinion is firmly on your side." Elena nodded. She felt no thrill, no rush, just clarity. "For years," she said softly, "I thought strength meant endurance." Her father turned to her. "And now I know," Elena said. "Strength is knowing when silence has done enough." Richard's downfall accelerated. Banks withdrew cooperation. Partners froze deals. Friends stopped returning calls. The man who once filled rooms now couldn't fill a voicemail inbox. The final blow came quietly. A letter, plain envelope, federal seal. Richard sat at his kitchen counter, hands shaking as he opened it. Notice of formal charges pending. Wire fraud, misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. He slumped into the chair. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a spin problem. This was reality. Weeks later, Elena returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant, not as a wife, but as a witness, briefly, formally, conclusively. She answered every question with precision. No bitterness, no theatrics, just truth. When it was over, Judge Whitmore nodded once. "You may go, Miss Blackwood." As she stood to leave, the judge added quietly, "You showed remarkable restraint." Elena met his eyes. "I learned it was my greatest leverage." Richard never saw her again. He watched her from a distance once, on a business channel months later. She sat at a conference table, confident, composed, speaking about governance, accountability, transparency. The host smiled at her. "Ms. Blackwood," he said, "many people are calling you one of the most unexpected power players of the year. What do you think made the difference?" Elena smiled us. Lightly. "I stopped trying to be heard," she said, "and started letting people reveal themselves." Richard turned the TV off. The penthouse was sold. The accounts were drained. The name Hale faded from relevance faster than anyone expected, because power without integrity doesn't collapse loudly. It disappears. One evening, Elena stood alone on her balcony, the city stretching endlessly below. Jonathan joined her, handing her a glass of water. "Any regrets?" he asked gently. She thought for a moment. "No," she said. "Just lessons." He nodded. "That's power," he said. "Earned, not taken." Elena looked out at the lights. For the first time in her life, she wasn't standing behind anyone. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't surviving. She was choosing. And that was the final truth Richard Hale never understood. They thought the wife was powerless, because she stayed quiet, because she didn't fight for attention, because she didn't beg to be believed. But silence, when backed by truth, isn't weakness. It's strategy.